Hello, my name is Sarah Styler, and I'm happy to be here virtually from Canada to present some of my group's research looking at the chemistry of urban road dust. I have to say, I attended Dust 2016, which seems like a very, very long time ago, and I had an absolutely wonderful time. So presenting from my hotel room is a bit of a downgrade, but I'm happy to be here nonetheless. So my group is very interested in chemistry at the surface of dust because of the ways in which that chemistry can influence the concentration of different pollutants in the atmosphere, whether these are primary pollutants emitted directly or secondary pollutants formed in the atmosphere via secondary processes. And one of the things that we've become more interested in recent years is rather than just desert dust as a reactive surface, we're interested in road dust as a reactive surface. And one of the reasons why we're interested in this is because road dust is a much more chemically complex dust source than desert dust. So it has a lot of influence from anthropogenic sources, whether these are things like non-exhaust emission, exhaust emissions, or partitioning in of pollutants from the atmosphere itself. And so road dust and road dust chemistry is especially important in a place like my former institution, the University of Alberta, where in the winter there's a lot of traction material put on the roads because it's actually too cold to use salts, to only use salts. And so this is just a picture of the street sweeping storage area in Edmonton. You can see it's quite a large mountain of materials. And so my group is really interested in the kind of chemistry that can happen at the surface of this material. So today I'd like to talk about two separate stories related to this. I'll note that my original presentation was focusing exclusively on oxidant production at the surface of road dust, but various COVID restrictions have sort of precluded us making as much progress on that as I would have liked over the past while. And so what I'd like to talk about instead is a more broad look at some of the work we're doing in this area. So I'll start with the first part of our work in this area, which is looking at gas uptake by road dust and non-exhaust particulate matter. And so the student leading this is Maya Abughanim, who is a PhD student in my group who's just about to defend and will be going to conduct postdoctoral research at NOAA in Boulder, Colorado this January. And so she presented earlier this week on some of our work at the surface of TiO2 aerosol. So in order to look at some of this chemistry of road dust with different atmospheric gases, we use what's referred to as a coated wall flow tube. And so essentially this is a reactor where we put our sample of interest and we expose it to a gas of interest. And so this is a picture of the actual reactor, but I'll show a picture of it in sort of a schematic way as well. So what we do in these experiments is we take our road dust surface and we expose it, or we don't expose it, to ozone. So we have a movable injector that we push in past the surface of the sample that we're interested in. And at the end of the flow tube, we measure the concentration of the pollutant gas we're interested in. And then at that point, what we do is we pull back our sample injector. And what we can see is that if the concentration of ozone at the outlet of the tube goes down, that means there's some kind of chemistry happening. And then at the same time, this reactor is surrounded by UV lights. So if we turn on those lights and we see a further decrease in ozone concentration, this tells us that there is both chemistry and photochemistry happening at the surface of these samples. So what do we get out of these experiments? What sort of data do we actually end up getting? It turns out it looks something like this. So in this experiment, what I'm showing is the concentration of ozone as a function of time. And so if we move from left to right on this graph at the top right, we can see that when we pull back the injector, this is the blue point, we can see a reduction in the concentration of ozone, and then it returns, gradually returns back towards some sort of steady state value as the surface is deactivated and saturated. Then when we turn on the light, we see a decrease in the concentration of ozone, which means there's some sort of chemistry happening. So that's shown in yellow. And then when we turn off the light, we see that the concentration goes back up. And finally, when we push that injector back in, the concentration returns to its original value. So what can we get out of these data? What we can pull out from this is by comparing the ozone concentrations, we can get a rate constant for reaction of ozone on the surface. So here, this is K. And then we can take this K and we can convert it to a value known as gamma, or an uptake coefficient. And what this is the fraction of collisions of ozone with that surface that leads to loss from the gas phase. And we care about this specifically because this is the kind of information that is included in atmospheric models to tell us about how important different surface reactions are. And then what we do with that value is we scale it by the surface area of our dust samples, because you could imagine that if you have a sample with a very large surface area, then it provides a larger surface for reaction. So to compare different types of samples, we need to do something to normalize our data. So one of the things we were really interested in doing was to get a sense of how the humidity in the atmosphere influences the uptake of this pollutant to the surface of road dust. And so what we did was we performed these experiments as a function of relative humidity, so how moist the atmosphere is in these cases. And so one of the interesting things that has been seen previously in the literature, this is a picture on the bottom left showing ozone loss. So the different curves show the decrease in ozone with time upon exposure to iron oxide, so in this case hematite. And what you can see, hopefully you can see, is that as we go from dry conditions, where there's a lot of loss of ozone, to wetter conditions, the ozone loss is much, much, much less significant. And so what researchers think is happening is that the sites, the active sites on the surface for reaction, are actually being taken up by water. So the reactivity of the surface is actually being suppressed. Interestingly, though, we don't see this kind of behavior. So this picture I'm showing on the right here are these gamma values, so the reactivity of our samples, as a function of humidity of the surface, of the gas flow, essentially. And so what you should be able to see is that in the presence of, or in the dark, which are these dark color squares, I believe. Sorry, my screen is actually quite small. I'm used to seeing these presentations on a large projection, but I'm seeing them very small on my own screen. So the idea here is that the gamma value is going up slightly as we increase the humidity. The behavior of this reactivity in the light is a whole other story. But what I will say is that the behavior where the reactivity is decreasing with light implies, for a variety of reasons, that the organic, the gunky, organic, anthropogenic part of the road dust is the part that's mediating some of that reactivity. But the main part of interest for us at this point was that we didn't see the suppression of reactivity at higher relative humidities. And so we thought maybe this has to do with something like ozone reaction with chloride. In the winter, we have some salts and we have a lot of these gravel traction materials. And so we wanted to see, is there any salt in our sample to begin with? And what we found in this case is that the concentration of chloride in our sample is actually, percentage levels of chlorine in the samples. And this is because we use both this salt material and the gravel material, and it stuck around into the springtime when we collected our samples from Edmonton. And so in this case, as we rinse the samples, somewhat obviously the concentration of chloride goes down, but the chloride is still present in the samples to begin with. So it means that there's some residual chloride even during the spring months after road icing has stopped, or road anti-icing has stopped. So this was interesting. And then we thought, what's happening when this ozone reacts with the chloride? What kind of reaction might be happening? And so we wanted to set up an experiment to see if we could see some sort of evidence of this oxidized chloride and some formation of what's referred to as reactive chlorine in the atmosphere. And so what we did was we took the outflow of this flow tube and we put it through a reducing impinger. So what this does, the sodium sulfite, is it's turning any chlorine-containing species just to chloride, and we can look at it using ion chromatography. So we take our aliquots from the liquid that we're passing the outflow through, and quantify it using ion chromatography. So what do we end up seeing? We end up seeing, in these cases, we performed a lot of different blank experiments where we didn't see any chloride at all, but we performed some experiments using a positive control, an iron chloride, which is known to form chlorine-containing gases. And then we also looked at anti-icing material. So this is an organic salty material that's placed on roads in the winter. And the idea is that it's less toxic than just using salt itself. So often it's molasses sugar based. And so in this case, we found that that was producing huge quantities of chlorine in the gas phase from this kind of reaction. And so in this case, the sample of interest here is the purple diamonds, where you can see that obviously for the sample, the production of this chlorine is much higher than that for the blank. So the idea here is that we are actually oxidizing chloride off the surface of these samples, and we are producing some sort of chlorinated gas that could then photolyze in the winter atmosphere to be a wintertime radical source. So how do we care about this, and how does this relate back to health, which is the topic of this session? The idea is that the oxidant profile in an urban area can influence the pollutant lifetime, the gas phase pollutant lifetime. It can influence what kind of products are formed. The oxidant is important, whether we have chlorine or whether we have ozone or whether we have hydroxyl radical, it influences the product distribution. And so it's really important, if we want to understand wintertime chemistry in cities, to have a good handle on what the oxidants are. And so in this case, our wintertime surfaces, our road dust and our street materials are actually changing the chemistry of the overlying atmosphere. So to wrap up then, we need to have a sense of how to model this chemistry and to get a sense of how this influences urban air quality. And so that's something that we're continuing to work on in my group. But I wanted to also, of course, talk about singlet oxygen in the environment and some of the work that we're doing in this area that's ongoing. And so this work specifically, we're interested in thinking about road dust as an oxidant source. And we are thinking about this because, as I mentioned previously, we have all of these pollutants, organic pollutants in many cases, that are present at the surface of dust. And so we really want to know, how does this kind of chemistry influence the lifetime or the fate of these materials? And so this work is actually being done by Alex Burnett, who's a fourth-year student in the group, and was started by Stephanie Schneider in my group, who's now doing a PhD at the University of Toronto and finishing up fairly shortly. So what we do in these experiments is we take dust samples and we put them in aqueous suspension. We shine light on them using a solar simulator. And then we put some sort of probe molecule in that reacts with the oxidant that we're interested in. And then we look at the product formation or the loss of a probe using UV-vis spectroscopy. And this tells us what's the concentration of this oxidant. So here I'm showing this oxidant using just a star because this is a general technique that we can use for detection of lots of different oxidants. So in this case, we're using an oxidant known as, a probe known as furfuryl alcohol. And this reacts selectively with singlet oxygen. We can pull out a rate constant for this. And then we can pull out from that a steady state concentration of our oxidant. Just by doing some calculations about the second order rate constant between the probe and singlet oxygen. And so what we end up seeing is that this probe is going away faster with road dust than our control, which means really that we have some sort of road dust catalyzed loss of this material, which means that we have some singlet oxygen present. And what we found actually is if we do these kind of experiments and pull out a singlet oxygen concentration and we normalize it again to surface area, we find a couple of different things. The first one is that road dust on the right in pink is much more reactive than desert dust on the left in gray, as you can see just from the scale here. And then also we see that, what's happening here? Okay, sorry, I'm having some sort of an issue with my with my animation. Anyway, so what we see as well is that the smaller road dust fraction is actually the most reactive. So as you go from larger particles to smaller particles, which are still quite large, smaller than 45 microns in this case, we are seeing that there's a higher reactivity of these smaller materials. And so the interesting thing is that actually, as you go from large to small, you're actually increasing, or the involvement, or excuse me, the organic carbon content of these samples is increasing. And so my group was interested in thinking about whether it's the organic carbon that's mediating the reactivity of these samples. And so in the end, what we actually found was that the reactivity of these samples was correlating with the UV vis absorption of our road dust materials as well. And so what we think is happening here is that we have some dissolved oxygen in solution. We have some chromophoric dissolved organic matter, often triplet state. So this is CDOM or CDOM. And so what's happening is it's the chromophoric dissolved organic matter is absorbing light, going into its triplet state, and it's acting as an energy transfer agent that's actually turning ground state oxygen into this reactive singlet oxygen that can then react with different pollutants and change potentially their environmental lifetime. So this was just one sample from one location, and so we really wanted to expand on these results and get a sense of how applicable they are more broadly. And so what we did was we're currently collaborating with Dr. Claire Wiseman at the University of Toronto to look at the reactivity of road dust from a lot of different locations. So as I mentioned in the previous study, we were looking at road dust from one specific spot. Here, what we're doing is looking at road dust or street sweepings that were collected. So these are sub 10 microns, so these are suspendable materials. And what we found is that all of these samples are sources of singlet oxygen. So Alex was able to look at samples from arterial roads, so main roads in this urban area, local and residential roads and expressways, and you can see that there's a range of different concentrations of singlet oxygen that are produced. But the important thing, and the more sort of generalizable conclusion is actually that this production of singlet oxygen is actually scaling here with the organic content of the samples. So here I'm showing on the y-axis the singlet oxygen concentration, and on the x-axis the loss on ignition value. So this is the organic carbon content of the sample, or a proxy for the organic carbon content of the sample. And so what you can see obviously here is that there's a definite correlation between these values. So it means that the parts of road dust that make it different from desert dust are also the parts that are making it more reactive. So these organic materials are really contributing to the reactivity that we're seeing. Okay, so to finish up then, what we've been able to show is that we actually have this singlet oxygen production by road dust. We're also looking at hydroxyl radical production, but that's beyond the amount of time I have today to chat with you. But the idea about all of this is that if we're producing these oxidants, then this could potentially be changing the lifetime and the fate of contaminants that are present at the surface of road dust. So to sum up, basically, we have this idea that this road dust chemistry is changing the lifetime of potentially health-relevant pollutants at its surface, but also potentially changing air quality in urban areas with associated impacts for human health. So with that, I'll finish up. I'll thank a variety of different funding sources. At my former institution, the University of Alberta, I'd like to thank for funding and also for a lot of experimental assistance in putting together our different experimental apparatuses. And then finally, I'd like to thank my group members, some of whom are shown here. This is not my giant group. This is the entire environmental chemistry community at the University of Alberta when we were able to have in-person meetings. And so, my group, a large fraction of them have moved with me to McMaster University, my current institution. And I would say that it's the students in the group who have really driven this work forward and done an excellent job in finding out a lot of interesting things. So I'm happy to take questions by email, and I look forward to in future coming to this conference in person. So with that, I will stop presenting and recording, and thanks very much for the opportunity to share my work with you.